You
Thank
are
you.
on.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming back. Um, Today, I'd like to talk about Frederick Augustus Heinze for as long as that takes, and then William Clark's later years and his youngest daughter, Huguette. Uh, I thought when I started to write and prepare the presentation for the Montana Luncheon Group about Heinze that would be an easy thing to do. Uh, there was a book about Heinze that was written by Sarah McNeilis. Sarah was a history teacher at Butte High School when I was there. I took, I think, a history course from her. She had a sister, Mary, who taught grade school English at McKinley School. I took English from Mary McNeilis. Uh, Sarah's book started out as a master's thesis in history at the University of Montana between 1943 and 1947. Uh, it was turned into a book in 1968, and then it went out of print, and it was reissued in 2018. And the background here gets a little bit complicated, but I have to go through this so you can understand where I'm coming from as I make this presentation. The question in general is, who was Heinze? I'll call him Fritz Heinze. What did he do, and why did he do it? Heinze is sort of a shadowy character. Didn't know much about him, but I thought that by reading Sarah McNeilis's book, it's a little short book, it would be relatively easy to do a presentation for the Montana group. But that wasn't true. The 2018 edition has an afterword by Zenabeth Naglashian, who I have known ever since I was in the fourth grade at McKinley Grade School. Zenabeth, her father was a professor at the Montana School of Mines. Our parents of our families attended the same church. We went through school together. She was at the University of Montana when I was there. She was a journalism major, wrote articles about Central Board meetings while I was a member of Central Board and student body president. And she had a career in journalism in Butte ever since. If any of you are from Butte, you, I'm sure, know her. So she wrote this afterward. She caused the book to be republished. And she explained in the afterword how it came to be. And what happened was that Sarah wanted to do a master's thesis about Heinze. She spoke with a thesis advisor in the history department. She was told that there were books by C.P. Connolly and Glasscock about Heinze, doubted that it was worthwhile to pursue. But if she could find some people who knew Heinze, find some new documents, maybe she could do it. And so she pursued it. And what she did was she found Otto Heinze Jr., who was one of Fritz Heinze's older brothers. Sarah knew someone in Butte who knew Otto, who was then retired living in New York. And he was delighted to give her information to portray his brother in a better light. So they had extensive correspondence. And if you look at her book, it's all of the footnotes are to correspondence with Otto Heinze. That's where her information came from. The book has a text and it has an extensive chronology. It's much larger. The chronology is larger than my chronologies in relation to the text. When she finished the thesis, it was reviewed by a couple of professors. One of them said, well, it relies too much on one source, Otto Heinze. And another one said, well, it presents Fritz Heinze in too favorable a point of view. But they passed the thesis. She got her master's degree in history. At that time, K. Ross Toole, who became one of Montana's leading historians, was also a graduate student in the University of Montana History Department. He knew about that thesis. He persuaded Sarah to use part of it for an article in the Montana Magazine of Western History in 1952. But Sarah was very protective of that thesis. She did not want it published or reissued. But when Toole became chairman of the history department at the University of Montana, he persuaded her to allow the thesis to be published as a book. And it was supposedly reviewed by a professor and a graduate student. They edited it. Sarah apparently was not too pleased with how it was edited. It was published, and then it went out of print. I found a copy in a used bookstore in Butte a number of years ago. It's an autographed copy. I just tried to read it. It was difficult to read. I put it aside. But when the reissued book came out in 2018, that seemed to me to be a good moment to have Heinze become one of the subjects for my annual presentations, particularly since Zena Beth had written an extensive afterword about Sarah and Mary McNeilis and their lives and how the book came to be. But as I got into it, I realized that the narrative that Otto Heinze had given to Sarah McNeilis was not entirely correct. It varied materially from accounts in Michael Malone's book, The Battle for Butte, C.B. Glasscock, The War of the Copper Kings, Connolly's book, The Devil Learns to Vote, Reno Sales, Underground Warfare in Butte. And the more I got into it, the less I could trust the narrative in Sarah's book. And I got to the point where I cross-checked every significant event that Sarah described against these other writers and found they were materially different, not just in detail, but just materially different stories. Heinze lived at our dinner table for months. My wife, Kathy, was getting tired of it, I think, as I told her what I had found that day about the inconsistencies of these stories. And I had written a version of the paper for the men's group that focused on all of the inconsistencies. I was unhappy with the inconsistencies, but I didn't want the paper to be about the inconsistencies. I wanted it to be about Heinze noting where the inconsistencies were. So that's why my chapter is written the way it is. And I will note the inconsistencies. I won't beat up on Sarah McNeilis, but I will say, though, that she did rely too heavily on what Otto Heinze told her. So, and in fairness to her, some of these other sources were not written until years later. But I'll try to tell you as best I can the way I think Heinze's story went. What is written about him is what he did, but not why he did it. And that became an interesting subject or question as far as I was concerned. So let's start. Heinze was much younger than Clark or Daly. Clark was born in 1839. Daly was born in 1841. Heinze is considered to be the third Copper King, but he wasn't born until 1869. So he's about 30 years younger than Clark and Daly. He was born in New York City. His father, Otto Heinze Sr., was a German immigrant who had successfully created a dry goods importing business. Growing up, Heinze went, and his older brother Otto went to school in Germany for 4 years, two different places. And so they maintained a contact with their German heritage and background. Heinze came back to New York. He lied about his age to get into the Columbia School of Mines. The minimum age requirement was 16. He said he was only 15. He said he was 16. He went through the program at the Colorado School of Mines, received an engineering degree, a C with a C average, but he was an engineer of mines at age 19. So he then really wanted to come west and come to Butte to begin a career as a mining engineer. Otto Sr. said that he would pay for Heinze to take another 2 years of mining courses at the University of Freiburg in Germany, which apparently had one of the world's leading mining engineering schools. Otto Sr. would pay for that. If Heinze didn't want to do it, if he went west, Otto Sr. would give him $100, and that would be the end of it. So Heinze chose to come west rather than go to Freiburg, Germany at that time. So Heinze comes west. He ends up in Butte in September 1889. Now, recall from the discussion we had last week that at that point, Butte is well developed as a city. It has, in 1890, it had over 10,000 people. Clark and Daly were clearly the dominant figures then. The feud had started. Recall that Clark had been defeated as a territorial delegate in the in the territory in 1888, and the talk in the community was about the feud and what's going on with Clark and Daly. So Heinze then goes to work as a surveyor in one of the working for the Boston, Montana company. This was the Lewishon company. It was the major competitor to Anaconda at that time. And one of the first questions, was, well, what was his status exactly? McNeilis says that Heinze began working as a mining engineer at Boston, Montana company at $250 a month. This is page 6 of chapter 3. But the other writers say that's not true. He might have been a mining engineer, but he worked as an underground surveyor, and he was paid $5 a day. Now, maybe that's not too important, but it's a matter of status as to what he was doing there. But so he's a surveyor for the Boston, Montana company, $5 a day, living in a shack in Meterville, but he has access to all of the maps and charts showing the underground workings of the Boston, Montana company mines and where the ore bodies are. And he also then hangs out at the Silverbow Club, socializing with people. He plays the piano. He sings German Mittellieder songs, which are medieval love songs. That's kind of incredible. He's a good fellow, and but he learns a lot. He learns about where the veins are and the ore bodies, at least in the area that Boston, Montana company controlled. At that point, he decided that supposedly that what Butte really needed was a smelter that was independent of the larger smelters that Anaconda and Clark and others had, that could provide smelting services for independent miners at lower cost. So he puts together a prospectus showing that this smelter would cost $100,000. But he also tells Otto that he should really watch the rarest mine. Heinze has his eye on the rarest mine, which is one of the mines in the Butte, Montana company system. Heinze goes back to New York in the fall of 1890 and asks his father, Otto Sr., to invest $100,000 in this smelter. Otto Sr. doesn't do it. He's not going to invest in something that he's not familiar with. Tells Heinze to go on form a company, go on the market, see if he can raise funds. As a public company, Heinze isn't able to do that. So he comes back to Butte. He instead works on the staff of the Mining Engineering Journal in New York City, and then comes back to Butte in the spring of 1891. Now, a couple of points here. One is that Otto told Sarah that Heinze went back to work for Boston, Montana company as a surveyor. But the other writers say, and Sarah's chronology acknowledges that what he did instead was to form an informal partnership with a couple of other people, one of whom might have been his brother, Arthur Heinze, and started low-scale mining in Butte, selling the copper to a concentrator and having it processed through a concentrator and then processed on to New York finally for smelting. And here, I guess I should digress to say that Fritz Heinze was not in this by himself. His oldest brother, Arthur, 5 years older, was a law school graduate from Columbia University Law School. He graduated in 1888. He did not ever actually practice law, but he got involved with Heinze when the Montana Ore Purchasing Company was formed in 1893. Arthur Heinze was actively involved in going underground, looking at the geology, and then as litigation later developed, supervising the lawyers that Heinze hired to represent him. So I think it's important to keep in mind that at all times, Heinze had legal advice from an older brother that he valued highly. Heinze wrote a letter to their mother in 1898 saying how valuable Arthur's advice was. And he also had Otto Heinze managing the finance and the credit and those arrangements so that he didn't have to be concerned about that. And it was always sort of touch and go as to whether the Heinzes would have enough money to keep going. And Otto was responsible for lines of credit and finances and keeping it going from a financial point of view. So Heinze comes back to Butte. He starts up this partnership with a man named Gifford and probably Arthur Heinze Jr., or excuse me, Arthur Heinze. And then Otto Heinze Sr. dies in the fall of 1891. There's no indication that they had ever reconciled, that Heinze had gone back for his funeral, anything of that sort. But in early 1892, Heinze does go back and talks with his brothers about investing in the smelter, supposedly. And at that point, there is an inheritance that each of the brothers will receive $50,000 from a trust that Otto Heinze Sr. had established. But the money isn't available until the trust is processed and the funds are released. And that probably doesn't occur until the spring of 1893, when Montana Ore Purchasing Company is formed. But Otto Jr. told Sarah that what Heinze did then, once that decision was made to proceed with the smelter, he says that Heinze went to Europe for a year to try to line up financing for the smelter. And that simply isn't true. It's documented that Heinze went back to Butte. He resumed the mining with his partnership that he had, waiting for the money to come through from the inheritance. He got into litigation with an investor named James Murray, who owned the Estella mine, and he bought a mine, he leased a mine or two, and he and his partners were actively involved in Butte in 1892. Significantly, they shipped several million pounds of copper out from this partnership during those years. Now, why Otto told Sarah that Heinze spent a year in Europe, I have no idea. But there was no reason for him to do that. He needed to get back to continue developing his mining. So I believe that what happened is that the money came through in early 1893, and Montana Ore Purchasing Company was formed, but Heinze didn't, and they got altogether almost $100,000. Heinze put in his full $50,000. He became a 51% shareholder. The other two brothers put in portions of their inheritance, not all of it, but portions. And there were a couple of other smaller investors, Gifford and another person who owned a small percentage of the stock, McGinnis. So the money comes in, the company's formed, but what Heinze does then, he doesn't build a smelter right away. He purchases the concentrator that they had been running the ore through, increased the concentrator's capacity. He purchased Glengarry mine number 2 in autumn of 1893. He leased the Raris and Johnstown mines, which were owned by Boston Montana Company, and that held them until it was possible to buy them later. Now, and the key here is to keep in mind the comment that Otto Jr. says that Heinze made to him in 1890. I want you to keep an eye on the Raris. Now, the Raris mine had no value at all as such. Its upper levels had been mined out. It was not a productive mine. But the thing about it was, and as Reno Sales says in his book, Heinze thought he could show that the ore in the Michael Davitt and the Pennsylvania mines, which were owned by Boston Montana Company, had their apexes in the Raris Johnstown claims. Now, the apex theory here is that, under mining law, is that if an ore outcropping exists on a particular claim, the person who owns the claim owns that ore and has the right to follow it wherever it goes, even though it goes under the claim of somebody else. But then it becomes a matter of proof as to whether that's really true. You know, where the apex is, whether the vein is continuous, whether it's broken by faults underneath. But if you say follow the idea, you don't go by what they say, go by what they do. What Heinze and his brothers did was to set up a general mining, concentrating, smelting operation, with the concentrating mining coming first, so that by 1895, they had a fully integrated mining smelting operation. And at that point, Heinze buys the Raris mine. And there's questions about how much he paid for it. I talk about that at page 3-15 of the chapter. Otto Jr. told Sarah that that Montana Ore Purchasing had only $30,000, and so they made a down payment of $30,000 and obligation to pay the rest in a year when they did. But the other writers say that the Estella mine, which was very profitable, which Heinze had leased from James Murray and was involved in litigation with him, but they had were earning so much from the Estella mine that the profits from that could be used to buy the Raris Johnstown claims. So that's another area where there's a major difference between what Otto told Sarah and what the other writers say happened. So at that point then, which is really the first phase of Heinze's development, he had a smelter. It had doubled in capacity. In 1897, it employed 700 men, produced 20 to 25 million pounds of copper annually. By 1899, the smelter produced 24 million pounds of copper annually. So it was a successful operation simply based on the mines that Heinze had owned or leased and processed through his smelter. He didn't really need to start invading others' mines, but he did. And the first one was when the Raris invaded the Michael Davitt mine, probably starting about 1895, 1896. All of a sudden, after Heinze bought the Raris, it became highly productive. It was where that ore came from is hard to say, because for years the Raris was not considered to be valuable at all. But Heinze paid $400,000 for it, and it immediately became highly productive. And you can only infer that that's because he was invading the neighboring claim of the Michael Davitt mine to get at the ore in that mine. So that's how it starts. In 1896, Heinze's manager tells Heinze that Boston Montana Company wants to buy, is demanding that Heinze's claim be sold to it because the ore in the rarest mine is coming from the Davitt mine. Heinze is at this point in Canada dealing with the Canadian situation that I may or may not have time to get into, but Heinze comes back to Butte. He fires the manager. He finds out what's going on. He meets with a man named Bigelow in New York City, representing as president of Boston Montana Company. And here again, there's a difference in story. Otto tells Sarah that Boston Montana Company thinks that the ore in the rarest comes apexes on the Michael Davitt claim. Other writers say that Bigelow and Boston Montana was upset because Heinze was invading their claim based on the idea that the apexed in the rarest claim. So they have an argument and a falling out. Heinze offers to buy the ore in the claim in the Davitt mine for $250,000. It's been appraised at $220 million. Bigelow was upset. Lawsuit is filed. There's an injunction that prevents Heinze from mining in the rarest mine, which is actually mining in the Davitt mine. And that case is then tried in 1898. There's an injunction in place, a federal court injunction, which supposedly prevents both sides from mining this disputed ore. And the jury then finds, either as a hung jury or it finds in Heinze's favor. So at this point, you would think that, particularly since Arthur Heinze is there, that Heinze would figure out that if he is going to go into other people's mines, he's going to get sued. Or if he sues, they will countersue. And there will be litigation, expensive litigation, injunctions, orders to stop mining the disputed areas. And on that basis, his business model of processing ore through a smelter is simply not going to work because all of the property will be tied up. But Heinze keeps going. Instead, he redoubles his efforts. He hires more lawyers. He files more lawsuits, and ends up by 1900 increasingly angering Marcus Daly and Amalgamated, which by this time has taken over Anaconda and is in the process of taking over the Boston Montana companies. And they decide that he really needs to be stopped. So, excuse me. So that's the story up to about 1900. But the other thing that Heinze did was that he detoured into Canada, into British Columbia. And why that happened is, again, the subject of dispute. I talk about that, let's see, at page, it's in here somewhere. 3-18, 3-1920. Otto Heinze Jr. told Sarah that Heinze was invited to come to British Columbia to survey the mines there in the Rossland, British Columbia area. The other writers say that there was no such invitation, that Heinze just went in there. He invaded the area. He was he raided it, is the quotes from the other writers, because what he was doing was, this was a depressed mining area. There was one valuable mine, the Leroy mine. Heinze set up a smelter, entered into a contract with the owners of the Leroy mine to ship 600 tons a day on a narrow gauge railway that he built. He antagonized the Canadian Pacific, which had the railroad rights through that part of the world. He was going to set up a railroad competing with them to go from Rossland to um, to Vancouver, British Columbia. But along the way, he got land grants to build the railroad. There were people who owned the Leroy mine were concerned that if they couldn't supply 600 tons of ore a day, Heinze would sue them, get a large injunction, which or damage judgment, which would bankrupt them. And so that they put pressure on Canadian Pacific to buy them out. And the result was then that Canadian Pacific bought out Heinze. He had acquired a newspaper along the way with a man named Patrick O'Farrell as its editor. O'Farrell came with Heinze to Butte to start a Butte newspaper for him. And he was paid over $1 million for his efforts in doing that. And it suggests that, some of the writers suggest that Heinze did that as a practice run to see if he could do the same thing in Butte. All right, I don't see any comments so far. Does anyone have any questions to this point? I would say this is sort of a pause point in the Heinze chronology. Comments, questions? Okay. So part of the key to Heinze's success was being able to control the courts in Butte. Heinze realized, I believe, as early as 1896 in the meeting that he had with Bigelow in New York, that if there was going to be litigation, and litigation in the Montana state courts in Butte, Heinze had to be able to have friendly judges. So he was one of those who caused William Clancy to become a judge in 1896. And I talk about Judge Clancy at page 20 of the chapter. Clancy had just come to Montana. He was a lawyer, but he was a curbstone lawyer. He was going to run for Justice of the Peace. At this point, the Democrats and the Progressive Party, Populist Party, excuse me, had an agreement that they would support each other's candidates for judgeships. So Clancy goes into the Populist convention. He is nominated to be a Justice of the Peace, but he persuades enough delegates to vote for him for district judge, which is trial court judge. He gets nominated. And then in the joint meeting with the Democrats, he carries it by 2 votes. So he becomes the Democratic populist candidate for judge in 1896. There's a general Democratic populist sweep in that election. So Clancy is elected. I quote Glasscock at page 3-20 as to what he was like. And I just have to read this a little bit. On the bench, Clancy was a burlesque of judicial dignity, with feet cocked upon the chair, upon the desk before him. He would gaze out the window of the courtroom while the most highly paid attorneys in the country and engineers of the world wrangled to wedge their evidence into the record. Arguments of counsel or the testimony of witnesses left him unmoved. Indeed, he seldom appeared to be hearing what was said. So he's a remarkable guy. He rules for Heinze almost all the time in terms of granting injunctions. And that's sort of how Heinze keeps his litigation going. There were 2 judges, odd-numbered, even-numbered cases go to either judge, but all the cases somehow ended up with Clancy. So there's litigation going on increasingly through the 1890 period. One of those was, let's see. I guess I would also say that one of the things in here was a question of the asset transfers of Boston Montana Company to another company in New York. This is at page 321, 42. The situation here was that Montana Ore Purchasing Company was a Montana corporation. Boston Montana Company was a Montana corporation. Jurisdiction would be in Montana state courts. However, if Boston Montana Company was a citizen of another state like New York, there would be diversity of citizenship so that cases could get into the federal court system. So Henry Rogers, and who was by then in control of Boston Montana Company, thought that it would be a good idea to have Boston Montana Company transfer all of its assets to another Boston Montana Company in New York to create diversity of citizenship. That was done without notice to shareholders before the so-called Two-Thirds Act was adopted in 1899. Judge Clancy entered an injunction which prevented that. That went on for a couple of years, and eventually it ended up that the assets were transferred back to the original Boston Montana Company. The plan to defeat diversity jurisdiction was defeated, and so Heinze was able to continue to litigate that in the Montana state courts. So at this point, then, let's see. There's a question here. I've seen AMC on various historic items, Anaconda Mining Company or Amalgamated. It would depend on what you're looking at. It was Anaconda Mining Company until 1899. It was amalgamated from 1899 to 1915. It's a holding company. Anaconda continued as a subsidiary of that, and then it all became Anaconda Company after that. So to answer that question, I need to know more about the document you were looking at and the context. At this point, then, there's, Clark's interests and Heinze's interests come together. Clark is still trying to get into the United States Senate in the worst way, this time by electing a Democratic majority in the Montana legislature. Heinze is interested in having a Democratic majority, particularly in Butte, so he can control the judges and elect friendly local officials in Butte. So there's an all-out war in the 1900 election between Clark and Heinze on the one hand, and Daley and the Anaconda Company, which are also Democrats, but then the Republicans also on the other. The Clark Heinze group wins the election. There's a clear Democratic majority in the Montana legislature. They elect Clark to the Senate, fair and square. And at that point, and the judges, Heinze's judges, are reelected. These are popular elected judges. They're elected. There's a new judge, Harney, who's elected in 1900. So there's 2 out of 3 judges in Butte who are loyal to Heinze. And that gives him power in the courts going forward for at least another 4 years. And Clark is elected to the Senate. So at that point, Clark abandons Heinze and goes over to join with Daley and Amalgamated. No, excuse me, not Daley, he's dead by then, but goes over to Amalgamated, leaving Heinze isolated. But that doesn't appear to bother Heinze very much. He, as I say at page 325, he's unintimidated by Clark's desertion. It seemed to act as a stimulus. And there's a description of Heinze at that point by Connolly that he, at page 325, Heinze was then about 30 years old, tall, well-proportioned, physically powerful, combination of the bohemian and the calculating man of affairs, displayed a poise which always made him a commanding figure. He stood 5'11" in height, weighed 200 pounds. His figure was as perfect as that of a Greek statue. Skillful musician, a brilliant linguist, could box with the art of a professional, And he could also drink anyone under the table. He partied 7 nights a week, gave lavish parties, and it was really an unusual character. So this was going on then between 1900 and 1902, thereabouts. There was another case involving the Mini Healy mine, which started out as a contract dispute between Heinze and Miles Finland, who was an investor, mine owner, ended up building the Finland Hotel in Butte. Whether an oral agreement that Finley had made with Heinze to turn over a lease and an option to purchase that mine was enforceable. Finland had assigned his rights to Boston Montana Company. Amalgamated took it over when they acquired that company. And the result was that there was a trial in 1903 that awarded full legal title to the Mini Healy mine to Heinze, which gave him $10 million in proven ore reserves and opportunities for further apex suits against other mines. At this point, Heinze had concluded that the Mini Healy mine could be used to go after ore in the adjoining mines. The Piccolo Gambino veins were rich mines that joined the Mini Healy. Let's see. At this point, the litigation is escalating. At one point, Heinze has 37 lawyers who were working for him under the direction of brother Arthur. And the thing that brings Heinze down finally is that there was also litigation concerning the validity of Amalgamated's acquisition of the Anaconda Company and its affiliates. Judge Clancy finally ruled in, the lawsuit was filed in 1901. Judge Clancy sat on it for 2 years. In 1903, he ruled that the acquisition was illegal and that therefore Amalgamated could not control the stock of these companies. The Anaconda Company could not receive dividends. The whole conglomerate had failed. And at that point, as I think I mentioned last week, Rogers then, on behalf of Amalgamated, shut down the state of Montana, all of the operations of Amalgamated and Anaconda Company until the legislature passed the Fair Trials Act, which provided that a litigant could change venue, which means changing litigation from one county to another, and also changing a judge if the litigant believed the judge was biased against the party. So that then forced the legislature, the governor, to call a special session of the legislature to pass that legislation before Amalgamated would reopen its facilities. This question, can you explain the basics of the law of the apex? Okay, the idea is that if there's a mining claim and if there's an outcropping of ore on that claim, the owner of the claim owns that vein of ore, no matter where it goes. So you start from the surface, mining this outcropping, and follow the vein down. And then if it turns or goes sideways, which veins often do, and goes under somebody else's claim, then the owner of the apex has the right to the ore in that vein, even though it's within the boundaries of an adjoining claim. Now, obviously, that's a matter of proof. You know, where did that ore come from, and what was the source, and which claim had the apex? Is it number one or number two? And that litigation was complex. It involved expert opinion and models and simulations, and went on for years. And it tied up then the property, because judges would say neither side should be able to mine that ore until the ownership had been determined. I don't know whether that law still exists or not, but what required in other places was that there be a consolidation of ownership so that doesn't matter where the claim apexes, the same company owns it either way. So that led the Fair Trials Law and the election of 1904, where Heinze's judges were defeated, led to his downfall and to the eventual settlement with Anaconda in 1906. Heinze couldn't continue. He couldn't succeed in court, and he wasn't getting ore because of all of these lawsuits to run a smelter. And so the brothers settled for between $10.5 and $12 million in February 1906, and then went back to New York. So the question is, why did Heinze do what he was doing? Was there any rational basis for that? And keeping in mind, that he has legal advice and is economically minded. And what Malone concludes, and I agree with this, is that at some point, Heinze decided that he was going to make as much of a nuisance of himself as he possibly could, so that Amalgamated would have to buy him out. And he just kept doing it. The more injunctions were entered, the more lawsuits were filed. Heinze had lawyers who were looking for lawsuits to file. He just kept it up until it became a duel between Heinze and Henry Rogers as to who was going to cave first. And so after the Fair Trials Act was passed, after the 1904 election, the brothers realized that that was the time to settle and get out. And so they did, and they received $10.5 to $12 million for their efforts. And at that point, Anaconda Company owned all of the Heinze interests. Does anyone have any? So that's a pause point. Does anyone have any comments, questions about this so far? And so that's the story of Heinze and Butte. Was he a copper king? I'll let you decide if he was a copper king. He's considered a copper king, but if you think about what he did, he's really a disruptor and a taker. He's not a maker and a builder like Clark and Daly were. He's just different, and had the other part of that is that as these injunctions were entered and the mine stopped working, there were miners who were unemployed, who had been mining those claims. The company would lay them off because they couldn't operate the mines. And so there was a negative effect on the community. And yet community supported Heinze against the New York Trust, the New York Trust. And there's a famous speech that Heinze gave on the courthouse steps in October 1903 that I've attached in the supplemental materials. And telling them that if Amalgamated puts him out of business today, he's going to go after them tomorrow, and they really need him to stand up and fight. But at the same time, or soon thereafter, he was busy settling their claims and getting out while he was still representing that he was helping the miners in Butte. Question: what was Heinze's personal life like? He did not marry until he left Butte, right? Well, Heinze, he worked all day and he partied all night. He was single all the time he was in Butte. He was just, I think, consumed with what he was doing. And his personal life was the parties and the carousing, not carousing, but poker games at night and drinking and in a public way. He did not marry until, I think, 1910, married a woman named Beatrice, a former actress. They had a brief, unhappy marriage. They divorced in a interlocutory decree and got back together just before she died. They had one son, Fritz Heinze Jr. I don't know what became of him. So he did not have a normal personal life, I guess, was the answer to that question. Okay, so the Heinze go back to New York. Heinze is going to start up another United Copper holding company, which is really just a shell. He gets involved in banking in New York, and the way the stock is handled leads to the panic of 1907, which causes the Heinze company in New York to go bankrupt. That's all covered in the chapter. I won't say any more about that. But Heinze is still a hero in Butte. He comes back in 1909, and he's greeted like a hero. The county attorney makes a speech about how wonderful he is, and he continues his socializing until really the end, and he dies in 1914 finally of cirrhosis of the liver, and he was age 43. So he had a long life in 43 years. Any questions about Heinze? Okay. Anybody disagree? Anybody think I'm unfair to Sarah McNeilis and Otto? Okay, well, let's move on then to William Clark and Huguette. Clark's life is also remarkable. There are two different tracks going on. Got something in my throat. On the one hand, Clark is actively involved in mining in Butte. He's developing the mines at the Verde copper mine in Jerome. He's actively campaigning to be elected to the United States Senate through the 1890s until he's finally elected in 1901. But along the way, his first wife, Kate, dies in October 1893. And the background there is that she and their 5 children had never, ever really lived in Butte since 1878. They had lived in Europe. They'd lived in Germany or France. So when Clark was building his mansion between 1881 and 1884, the family wasn't there. He must have been there by himself. All those years, Kate dies in 1893. But at that point, and apparently Clark's version of this is that he first met Anna La Chapelle by watching her at a July 4th parade in Butte in 1893, which is before Kate died. There was apparently some mutual attraction. He sent her to a girls' school in Deer Lodge for a couple of years. He employed her family, brother, father, mother, brother. So he adopted the whole family. And then in 1896, he sent her to Paris to live with one of his sisters in Paris, properly chaperoned by a widow of a French army officer or something. So she's living in Paris. Clark then starts buying property in New York in 1895 to build his mansion. He commissions architects 1887, 1897, 1898, starts a foundation for the house in 1900, starts building it 1901, 1911. So all of that time, while he is publicly the senator from Montana and actively involved in Montana mining, he has all of these other interests going on, including this mansion in New York and Anna in Paris. In 1901, he's asked if he ever plans to remarry, and he's one of the world's most eligible bachelors. He's very wealthy at this point. And no, I'm not going to remarry. I'm going to remain single. But the fact is, he claims then that he did get married to Anna in 1901 in Marseille, France, which is the south of France. And at the same, but it's documented that newspapers covering his trip to France, he was in the north of France at that time, and there's no record that they ever were actually married. There's an affidavit filed later that there's no record of that marriage. So Clark has two children, and Andre, who's born in 1902. She dies of meningitis in 1919 as a teenager, and Huguette, who is born in 1906 and lives to be 104 and dies in 2011. And at this same time, Clark has romantic relationships with several other women in the United States. And I've covered that in, let's see. There were several other women in the late 1890s, early 1900s. So there was that deception going on as to whether Clark, what his relationship was with Anna, and whether they were ever married. When Clark announced in 1904, I think, that he had been married, his children were surprised. They didn't know about it. They thought that, and they were concerned that maybe he would bequeath all of his wealth to Anna. But Clark said no, he wouldn't do that. He would give her a relatively minor bequest. He would, his estate would go to his children. And that's what happened. He gave Huguette, though, a 1/6 share, equal share with his other children. He gave Anna only about $3 million, did not give her the mansion in New York, and that was sold, and she moved into an apartment with Huguette. So there was that status at that time. The mansion is remarkable. It's Clark had bought a lot of art in Europe. He built a gallery, art gallery, in his mansion that was later transported to the Corcoran Museum in Washington, D.C. after he died. There's a picture of the mansion in the supplemental materials that I've given you. It's 6 stories tall. It burns 7 tons of coal a day. There's dozens of servants, an incredible thing. And you wonder why a family of 4 would need something like that, but apparently they did. Clark was determined to buy his way into New York society. To christen the mansion, he had a party in the mansion and sent out invitations to everybody in the New York 400, the society elite, and nobody came. Society snubbed him initially in 1911, but he persevered, and Anna in particular sponsored concerts and other gatherings that benefited French veterans in World War I by 1915, so that they became accepted as part of the New York society in their later years. Let's see, I need to check my time. Okay. So Clark then continues to expand his other interests. He cashes out of Butte. He sells his Butte mining properties to an amalgamated company in 1910 for $5 million. His wealth is coming from primarily the United Verde copper mine in Jerome and Clarkdale, which is one of the most valuable mines in the world. he has other business interests. He has agricultural interests in California. He built the Clark Road, the railroad from Salt Lake City to San Pedro, California, to shorten the time for travel from Southern California to the Intermountain States. You know, and he really must have been a visionary, because there was a new harbor that had been dredged in San Pedro, California, I'm sure to permit ships coming through the Panama Canal to dock there and then unload their cargo and ship it to the United States. The Panama Canal had just opened at that time, in 1907 or thereabouts. So Clark builds the railroad. It goes through a Mormon ranch, which we talked about last time, Las Vegas. The town of Las Vegas is formed because Clark sells town lots there. There's a railroad going to San Pedro, which is then the gateway to the Panama Canal and the rest of the world. So there is that going on. And then he has other interests in other places. Remarkable, remarkable. Okay, so, but it doesn't hold. When Clark dies, his family cannot hold on to the wealth. The properties are sold. The newspapers are sold in 1928, which is when William Clark Jr. had taken over several of the newspapers. The United Verde mine was sold in 1935, and with a huge quantity of copper ore, smelted copper in the yard at Clarkdale. So his empire simply did not continue. Any comments, questions about Clark before I move on? I know you're out there. I can see I have these participants, and where are you? Okay, well, so Huguette. Huguette, grew up in the mansion, and in 1925, when Clark died, she would have been 18, 19 years old. She moved out with her mother, Anna. They lived together in an apartment, apparently just down the street, a 14-room apartment down the street. She went to a finishing school, a marriage track finishing school in New York City. She had a brief, unhappy marriage to a man named William Gower in 1928-29. She would have been, 22, 23 years old. Gower worked as a clerk at an investment banking firm in New York, but he was the son of the controller of the United Verde mines and other mines apparently that Clark owned. So the connection there was that Gower's father was one of Clark's key employees. They had a brief unhappy marriage, apparently because it is said that Huguette would not consummate the marriage, but she maintained a warm relationship with Gower down through the years. Apparently, she continued to send him $3,000 checks monthly. He became the manager of the Paris office for Look magazine, and was in France for many years and died in the 1970s. So they had a friendly relationship until then. Other men in Huguette's life included a painter. His name was Thaddeus Steica. Huguette took painting lessons from Thaddeus. His thought that there might be some romantic involvement, but he ended up being a suitor of Negri, the actress, and that didn't work out. And there was another friend from France named Etienne Allard de Villemont, who they never married, but they remained friends, romantic pen pals. Huguette was a collector. She collected dolls and dollhouses, and she built models of interested in Japanese art and Japanese dolls. That went on for years. She and Anna continued to go to the Bellugardo estate in Santa Barbara for many years. That estate had been purchased by Clark and Anna in 1923. Anna had enlarged and remodeled it in the 1930s, so it was available to them at any time, and they would come out every year. It was fully staffed, maintained. The staff was directed that they should keep it in first-class shape so that on 1 or 2 days' notice, the Clarks could go out there and live. So they did that, but they stopped going in the 1950s, and the staff maintained it anyway for many years after that. I think the remarkable thing about Huguette was her later years. She, lived alone. She had all of this wealth. She collected art. She collected rich major art. She collected Stradivarius violins. She always played the violin. She played the Stradivarius violin. But in 1991, she had some facial cancers and went into the hospital in New York, to have those cancers removed. That was done, and there was no reason then why she could not return to her apartment. She had maintained her apartment. She bought another apartment so it would look like hers apparently for security reasons. But she decided to stay in the hospital and live there. And the hospital accommodated that, although they probably shouldn't have, because they realized that she was a major donor. And they repeatedly solicited gifts, multi-million-dollar gifts from her, which she eventually refused. They wanted a $125 million contribution so that they could build a new hospital, for example. She did give the hospital a Monet painting that was appraised for $6 million that the hospital couldn't sell at that price. But while she was there, she befriended a nurse, a 24-hour nurse named Hadassah Perry, and her family, and gave multi-million-dollar gifts to Hadassah and her family over a number of years. The rest of the Clark family lost track of her. She was last seen apparently at a gathering in 1968, but by this time the descendants and children are dispersed. There is a family reunion in 2008. No, excuse me. It's in 2008. This is 2-23 of the book. Huguette wasn't there, but her representative was there, and Chancellor, and he expresses unhappiness that she's being ignored. But the family discovers that she is beginning to sell assets to make her gifts, and that they become concerned. There's a cousin named Carla Friedman who investigates the situation. They contact the New York District Attorney's Office Elder Abuse Unit and learn that they go to investigate, and they find that Huguette is happy and content and confident where she is in the hospital, so they don't do anything about that situation. But by 2011, Huguette suffered heart failure and she died in 2011, leaving an estate that was worth $308 million before estate taxes, gift taxes, penalties, attorney's fees. That led to a will contest with all of the Clark relatives, descendants who never met Huguette, didn't know her. And on the one side, her will had created a Bellegardos Foundation to receive the estate in Santa Barbara, but without really adequate funding to keep it going. Litigation was filed, will contest litigation. A jury was selected, all ready to go to trial, and then the case settled. And the terms of the settlement are at page 2-24, where there's the relatives, Clark relatives, received $34.5 million. Hadassah pays back $5 million in gifts, but keeps $26 million that her family had received. Her advisors give up their executors' commissions. Lawyers are paid $30 million, get $78 million in gift taxes, interest, $26 million in estate taxes. So there is a settlement that sort of accomplishes what Huguette had in mind, but it ends up rewarding the relatives, the Clark relatives that Huguette never knew. It pays a lot of money to the government for estate and gift taxes and penalties, a lot of money to lawyers for handling this dispute. And so that's how it ends. So I don't know what conclusion you would reach from all of this. There's a question here: was the wealth that she died with exclusive of the value of the art that she owned? The estate included the art. I think some of the art was sold and it counted as part of the total value of the estate. But the $308 million was everything that she had at that time, including the Bellegardos estate. She sold one of the Stradivariuses. She sold the paintings. One of the paintings disappeared, which went to Henry Block in Kansas City. I cover that in the chapter. So it's remarkable that she died with all of that wealth and had given money, millions of dollars, to friends and people she liked, Hadassah and her family. So what is the moral there? It's Clark comes to Montana with 50 cents through his efforts, is investing, reinvesting, true capitalist. He ends up with an estate that's worth $100 to $250 million, and then it's dissipated, it's lost, I think, through the family. Can't hold on to it, and then the depression intervenes, I think, which doesn't help any. And then Huguette, on the other hand, lives a reclusive life, does what she wants to do, but her estate is worth $308 million, and a lot of it goes to the government or to lawyers. What would you do if you were Huguette Clark? What would you do under those circumstances, born into that situation probably as a reclusive, shy person to begin with, blessed or burdened with all of that wealth, and that was the story of her life. So I've covered a lot. I would open the floor, I guess, for questions, comments, discussion about any or all of this. I really would welcome your participation, so we don't have to end early. So what are your comments? Anyone?
Could you tell me what happened to the mansion after Huguette and Anna left?
Yes, well, it was demolished. After 2 or 3 years, it was sold for $3 million to a developer, and the developer tore it down and I think replaced it with apartment building. It was impossible to maintain. It was just a huge, monstrous thing. If you looked at the picture in the supplemental materials, it's incredible. And nobody could possibly live in that unless you're William Clark. And so they took out the furniture, they took out the marble, took out everything that was there and trashed it, tore down the building, and it became apartments.
Wow.
Okay.
Where in New York is that?
It's on, I think, either Fifth Avenue or I cover that in the chapter. Fifth Avenue and 77th Street. If you're familiar with New York, Fifth Avenue, 77th Street. And it started out as one lot on a corner, and he probably expanded it to 4 or 5 lots, buying up the houses and tearing them down so that he could build his mansion on a larger site, and then was involved in arguments and discussions with architects for contractors for 10 years as the building progressed. There's
some of her art came to the museum on the UM campus a few years ago. Some
okay.
of Clark's art collection.
There's a comment also here that the annual endowment to the Corcoran ended with her death. Well, the Corcoran got Clark's art because the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City didn't want it. And the reason they didn't want it was that they thought that there might be either copies or fakes in that collection, and they didn't want to fool with it. But the Corcoran took it with the understanding that they would keep it forever, and they built a wing on the museum, which was identical with the Doré gallery in Clark's mansion, so the art could be displayed exactly as it had been in Clark's mansion. But then apparently after Clark died, the Corcoran needed the money. They began to sell some of it. I don't know how much of it is still there. I think it's one of the writers about Huguette says that she displayed some of her art. She was an artist, and the Corcoran displayed some of her art in 1929, I think, at the Corcoran. Now, maybe that's the same art that came to the University of Montana. I don't know. Does the person who asked the question know where Huguette's art came from? Was it from the Corcoran, or where was it?
My recollection is that it came to, I may not be correct, but my recollection is that it came to the university's museum as a gift from possibly her nurse or someone to whom she had given some of her art. Does anybody else know?
Okay. As far as I know, I lived in DC for a while and went to the Corcoran a lot, and I do know about the arts that was there. But when the Corcoran closed, as I understand it, the National Gallery of Art took the art. It went to them. It had to go someplace. So the National Gallery of Art in Washington took the art and has been giving most of the art to more area art museums on the East Coast in that area. But some of the people from the University of Montana went out there to apply for some of that art to come out here, which more should have come than did because of how we financed Clark's art collection. But anyway, that's how the National Gallery of Art, or those there, made the decision on which pieces of art would come to Missoula.
Yeah, but what you're talking about is Clark's art, the art that came from Clark's mansion to the Corcoran, not Huguette's art. Huguette had apparently a small number of pieces which were displayed at the Corcoran. But I don't know that that became a part of the permanent Clark collection. Do you know?
No, I don't know about Huguette's art.
And the comment about it being a gift, it may be that she gave her paintings to Hadassah, and there's reference to a nurse coming from a nurse. Well, that would have been Hadassah, and it's possible that that art came from there. And I don't know what became of that or where it ended up. That's an interesting point. Well, I guess I would ask a general question for discussion is what do you think about Heinze? From what you've read, and if you know the story about Sarah McNeilis and Otto and read my chapter, what is your, was Heinze a good guy? Was he a bad guy? Was he a hero? Was he a thief? Was he a king or a pawn, or what was he? Anybody want to volunteer on that one? I see someone with a smile on their face looking back at me. Comments? What was Heinze?
I would just say he's really interesting. The other two are very interesting, but Heinze is like you just used all those adjectives. He's hard to pin down in terms of a concise definition or picture of him. Like you said, he was charming. He was, a gambler. He was a hard worker. He was apparently a brilliant speaker. He was able to turn some 1,000 of miners around by a speech on the courthouse steps when they were angry with him for being closed out of the mines, and he turned them around just with his speech. So he's pretty complex character, and would like to, if somebody could delve more into him, that would be fascinating.
Well, Sarah McNeilis tried, and I think that effort was really inconsistent with the other writers. I don't know that anyone else has done a full-scale study of Heinze. I got into it much deeper than I had originally intended as I began to read these other sources and saw the inconsistencies, and tried to define what the story was. But, Heinze had a legitimate point, I think, perhaps, if he really thought and believed that he could use the apex theory to pursue ore into other companies' mines. If you were not so charitable, you might say, well, that was all a fraud as well, and that there was no such valid claim, that ever was. He simply used this as an excuse to go into other people's mines and then get into litigation and tie everything up. But I think the remarkable part of that is that he knew in the beginning, in 1890, that he wanted to control the rarest mine, which at that point had no value at all. From the history of the publications about copper mining in Butte at that time, the rarest mine had no value in its terms of its production. But Clark really wanted that mine in the worst way, so he could use it, I think, to get at the ore in the Michael Davitt and in the Pennsylvania mines that the Boston and Montana Company controlled. Now, whether that's legal or not, is hard to say. What his strategy was is hard to say. But at some point, as I'll just say it again, just to get your comments, as the litigation got more intense, as the injunctions became more frequent, as production bogged down, and he needed the ore for his smelter to keep it going, he just redoubled his efforts and kept doing it, probably with the expectation that Amalgamated would have to settle with him, and he could cash out and leave and earn the $12 million and go away. So it became kind of a nuisance situation that he eventually succeeded, but he did not live a long and happy life. But that's just my point of view.
I have a question.
Yes.
Did Clark and or Daly not also invade each other's veins in the course of their feuds?
I don't think so. I haven't seen any indication of that. I think that these mines are territorial, and I think what they did was to buy or acquire mines that were close to the mines they already had. So it wasn't just a mine here and a mine there, separated by some distance. So I think the Anaconda mine had its surrounding mines that worked together. The Clark mines were sort of together. But Heinze never invaded the Clark mines. There's no indication that Clark or Daly invaded each other's mines. The disruption was caused by Heinze, who came in and invaded initially the mines that the Boston Montana Company had, where he was familiar with the geology. And then there was one of these, the Copper Trust case, was where he invaded mines that were owned by Amalgamated in 1900, where Daly decided that that had gone too far and that Heinze needed to be exposed as a thief and a bad person, and caused negative campaigning against him in the context of the 1900 election. So Heinze invades Boston, Montana initially. He then makes a pass at the Amalgamated through the mine that he had in adjacent to those mines. But otherwise, Clark and Daly's mines got along. Okay.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
A family connection in my family is a man named John Gilly. Is he a player in any of that late 19th century history that you know of?
I'm not familiar with that name. Do you know what he did?
I believe he was the supervisor of mines. He was a mining engineer who came originally from Canada and became, as far as I know, a highly respected mining engineer and eventually the supervisor of mines on the Butte Hill.
I'm sorry, I've got a phone call there. Please ignore that. I'm sorry. Okay, well, I don't know that. I don't know that name.
Okay.
Underground mine wars. It'll stop there. It stopped. Okay. Underground mine wars. Well, Heinze reached a point of desperation, and he needed the ore out of the Michael Davitt mine, and so they went in to the mine anyway, even though there was an injunction not to, and they were stopped. They were held in contempt, but they still continued to mine underground, and they became in conflict with miners from Amalgamated. And I trace that history in the chapter. There really were battles not with guns, but with water and smoke and blasting, which killed a couple of people. And finally, they decided not to do that anymore. But there was really competition underground for the ore that Heinze could not get legally because he was subject to these injunctions. That's what the underground battles were about. And finally, I think they realized that if they continued with that, people were going to get killed, and they really should stop it. And so they did. There was an agreement that they just wouldn't do that anymore. Okay. Well, I think I've used up my time for today, and I thank you very much for hanging in there, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And next time, I'm going to talk about the later history of Butte, Anaconda's history from 1920 until it was sold, the cave block and Berkeley pit mining, the effects on the Butte community. That's chapters 4 and 5. So I'll look forward to seeing you then. And thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.